Nestled in a quiet, sleepy town, the Blackened Spoon appeared to be the kind of restaurant where you would expect to enjoy an upscale gourmet meal. With elegant chandeliers, finely detailed woodwork, and crisp white linens, it was the picture of refinement. But despite its apparent beauty, there was something inherently unsettling about the place. The atmosphere always seemed just a bit too still, the silence a little too thick, as though it were trying to hide something. It was a restaurant you would visit, enjoy the meal and leave quickly, never truly taking in the surroundings. There was always a peculiar feeling, like walking into a space frozen in time, an illusion of perfection that made people avoid questioning the oddities. Its reputation was built on its fine dishes and word-of-mouth praise. But there were always rumors, whispers of things people didn't see. Guests often left feeling vaguely disturbed but never able to pinpoint why. The walls, the floors, even the air seemed to hum with an unspoken presence that made diners uneasy. They often said, "It's just an old place." But everyone knew that deep down the restaurant's charm was more like a facade masking a deeper, darker secret. Every night as the final meal was served, it was as if the restaurant itself was waiting, watching, for something that could never be named. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Sarah decided to try the Blackened Spoon after hearing glowing recommendations from friends. She had heard nothing but praise for the evening's special, braised lamb shank with mashed potatoes. She didn't hesitate when the waiter offered it to her. The dish was presented on a heavy, ornate plate, steam rising from it in delicate tendrils. The rich, savory smell filled her nostrils, and for a brief moment she felt a sense of comfort. But as soon as she cut into the lamb, something was wrong. The meat didn't pull apart easily like tender lamb should. It resisted her knife with an unnatural stiffness, its texture almost leathery. But it wasn't just that, it was the color. The lamb wasn't the deep red she expected, but instead a pale, sickly shade, more akin to something unidentifiable. Confused and disturbed, Sarah put the fork down, staring at the slice of meat on her plate. Her stomach churned, and she looked around the table to see if her friends had noticed. But they were all too distracted, sipping wine or nibbling at their own meals. Sarah's eyes darted nervously to the other patrons who seemed to be eating, as though everything was perfectly normal. But for her, the atmosphere suddenly became heavy, as if the air itself were pressing in on her. She picked up her fork again and examined the meat closer. The shape of the shank was entirely wrong, more rectangular than round, and the texture wasn't like lamb at all. It was hard, unnervingly so, and the flesh didn't flake apart the way tender meat should. As she lifted it to her nose, an overwhelming sense of wrongness filled her. It wasn't lamb. It couldn't be. The realization hit her like a cold wave. The meal wasn't what it seemed, and her unease had just begun. When Sarah tried to speak up, her voice barely broke through the heavy silence that had settled over the table. She looked around at her friends who were still distracted, unaware of the creeping dread that had taken hold of her. She couldn't ignore the growing sense of horror in the pit of her stomach. There was something distinctly off about the meal in front of her. It wasn't just that the lamb didn't taste like lamb. It felt wrong, as if it wasn't even from an animal at all. The texture was rubbery, unnaturally firm. Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Maybe it was some strange new preparation method, she thought, but she couldn't ignore the strange pallor of the meat. And then it struck her. Whatever this was, it wasn't just bad cooking. She looked around the restaurant, suddenly feeling trapped. The room seemed more oppressive now, and she noticed that the other diners hadn't left. The clock on the wall showed it was past 11:00 p.m., but no one was in any rush to leave. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just with the food, but with the entire atmosphere of the restaurant. As she pushed the plate aside and considered leaving, a cold chill ran down her spine. She glanced at the waiter who had just appeared by the table, and then at Chef Emile who was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. His eyes were locked on hers, and they seemed to hold a knowledge far darker than what should have been possible. His expression was unreadable, but the sense of malevolence in the air was palpable. Sarah's hands trembled as she pushed the plate further from her. She had to get out of here. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and she wasn't sure if it was the food, or if the whole restaurant was a part of something much darker. As Sarah sat frozen in a wave of confusion and dread, Mr. Blackwell, the head waiter, appeared beside their table, his usually polite expression replaced with an unblinking, unsettling stare. His movements were eerily smooth, almost mechanical. As he addressed Sarah, "Is there a problem with your meal, madam?" His voice, though polite, lacked warmth and seemed forced, as though it was a line he had repeated 1,000 times. But there was something else, something more chilling in his tone. Sarah felt a wave of cold wash over her, and she struggled to suppress the anxiety welling up in her chest. Before she could respond, Chef Emile emerged from the kitchen. His appearance only amplified Sarah's growing sense of dread. His face was pale, sickly even, and his eyes were dark, almost hollow. His stained apron and hands only added to the unnerving image. As he approached, Sarah tried to ask what was wrong with the food, but Emile mumbled something unintelligible under his breath. "It's just the last of the night's orders," he said, as if that explained everything. His voice was too low, too calm, and it felt like a secret he was unwilling to share. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as he stepped closer. She felt as if she were under his scrutiny, like she had become a specimen on display. The kitchen door behind him creaked open, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Something that didn't belong in a kitchen. She blinked quickly, thinking it was just her imagination. But the dread in her chest told her otherwise. Something was terribly wrong. The longer Sarah sat at the table, the more her surroundings felt off. It was as though the restaurant had come alive with a malevolent energy that she couldn't explain. The gentle clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation began to feel oppressive, like a distant hum beneath the surface of her mind. But then as she looked toward the kitchen, she heard it, a muffled scream. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A sharp, panicked cry that sent a chill down her spine. She stiffened, her heart hammering in her chest. No one else seemed to notice. The other patrons ate their food, oblivious to the horror unfolding just behind the walls. Sarah's eyes darted toward the kitchen, but all she saw were shadows moving quickly behind the closed door. She stood up, unsure of what to do, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But as she turned to face the front of the restaurant, she noticed Mr. Blackwell watching her with an almost predatory stare. His mouth twitched in what might have been a smile, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a cold, thin line that held no warmth. The air grew colder still, and she felt as if she were suffocating. The whispering voices in the corners of the room were louder now. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but the meaning was clear. They were warnings. The kitchen door creaked open again, and this time Sarah saw something or someone moving toward her in the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat as the figure became clearer, and her breath caught in her throat. What she saw in that fleeting moment would haunt her forever. Just as Sarah turned back toward her table, she saw something. A shape. It was dark and indistinct, shifting behind the kitchen door like a shadow that didn't belong. She blinked rapidly, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light, a play of the flickering lamps. But no. The shape moved slowly, deliberately. It wasn't human. It didn't walk like a person. It dragged itself, its form bending and twisting in a way that defied natural movement. For a split second, Sarah saw a face, pale, with hollow, empty eyes staring straight at her. The horror struck her like a thunderbolt. But before she could react, the figure disappeared back into the kitchen. She gasped, her heart racing. She couldn't be sure, but she was certain it hadn't been human. The feeling of terror flooded her entire body. She wanted to scream, to run, but the air around her seemed to tighten, pulling her deeper into the restaurant's clutches. When she turned to look at the others at her table, they were oblivious, lost in their meals, unaware of the growing danger that was closing in. But Sarah knew the truth now. This place wasn't just a restaurant, it was something far darker. And whatever that shadow was, it was watching her consume. And it consumed its guests. The last meal wasn't a special, it was a sacrifice, a final offering to something much darker than anyone could imagine. The whispers that filled the air, the unnatural silence that surrounded them. This place had a purpose, and that purpose Sarah tried to make sense of what she had just seen. Chloe, her friend sitting across from her, broke the silence. "What's that on my plate?" Chloe asked. Her voice was shaky and she sounded almost confused. Sarah turned to see that Chloe had been picking at her own meal, and her eyes were wide with uncertainty. There, on the plate, was something unrecognizable, an odd, translucent shape, almost gelatinous, that didn't belong. Chloe seemed hesitant to speak further, but Sarah could see the fear in her eyes. "It looks like... it's not what we ordered, is it?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. The more Sarah looked at the food, the more she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The rest of the table sat in stunned silence. Something wasn't right. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, to voice her concerns, but before she could, the lights flickered. It wasn't a brief flicker. This one lasted longer than usual. The room seemed to pulse in time with the light, as though the very air around them was shifting. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Everything felt wrong. The walls began to close in. Every shadow seemed to be moving, crawling toward them. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. It was like the restaurant was alive, waiting, watching, feeding on the terror of its guests. The last course was never meant to be consumed. It was just the beginning of something far more horrifying. Mr. Blackwell suddenly appeared at their table again, his icy grip seizing Sarah's wrist with a strength that belied his frail appearance. His eyes were cold, devoid of any warmth. "Is there a problem, madam?" he repeated in the same monotone voice, his gaze unblinking. He wasn't asking a question. He was issuing a command. Sarah felt her pulse race as she struggled to pull away. But it was impossible. The moment his grip tightened, it felt like she was being pulled into a nightmare, one from which there was no escape. "You've had the last order," he whispered, his voice low and sinister. The words echoed in Sarah's ears, and a chilling realization struck her. This wasn't just a restaurant. The Blackened Spoon was a place where customers came for their last meal, where every last order marked the beginning of something far darker. No one left the restaurant. The moment the last order was served, they were trapped. It was too late. She was the final guest, the last one to pay the price. The whispers, the shadows, the strange food. It all made sense now. She was caught in a cycle, a terrible cycle that had ensnared others before her. And once you sat at that table, you couldn't escape. The wall seemed to pulse with anticipation, and Sarah's heart raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The others at the table seemed oblivious to the danger, but Sarah knew she wasn't going to walk out of this place. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The way the restaurant had always felt wrong. The strange atmosphere that held everyone in its grip. The fact that no one ever left. Before the last order was served, this was no ordinary restaurant. The Blackened Spoon wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place to O's was to trap its guests in an eternal loop. There was no escape. The moment they sat down at the table, they were already part of the meal, and the price of that last order was one no one could pay in a way that made sense. It was only a matter of time before Sarah joined the others. Just another shadow, just another whispered voice, forever lost to the restaurant's hunger. The room went silent and Sarah felt a sharp, cold grip at the back of her neck. The lights flickered out completely, leaving her in darkness. She could feel the presence of something close, something far too large to be a mere shadow. Cold, clammy hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her back into the darkness. There was a sound behind her, scraping and dragging, and the faint, distant whisper of something hungry. The air grew heavier. The whispers reached a crescendo, now speaking directly to her in words she could barely understand. Then, in a voice that was barely above a breath, the figure behind her whispered, "You're the last one." A cold shiver shot through her spine, and she understood. She had crossed the line. The last course had been served, and she had paid the price. She was the new addition to the restaurant's endless cycle. There was no way out. The meal had been the beginning. And as Sarah's vision blurred, she realized with finality that the Blackened Spoon was never a place of fine dining. It was a trap, a place where the last diners never truly left, where their souls became part of the darkness that fed the restaurant's insatiable hunger.